Thank you so much, Jennifer. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning. Um, as Jennifer just mentioned, my name is Sam, and I'm a lead product designer here at Mode. And today we're going to talk about how to create on-brand reports that go above and beyond. Above and beyond is a fairly bold claim, and phrases like make it pop can always feel a bit buzzwordy. So before I start pitching my suggestions, I want to take a step back, in this case, way back, and actually start in a galaxy far, far away. The year is 1975. George Lucas has just finished writing his second draft of a rather out there science fiction movie. And despite his prior success in the film industry, studio executives are struggling to understand what it is exactly that he's trying to do. He's talking about creatures covered head to toe in fur, a bunch of new planets, intergalactic space travel. To put it bluntly, they don't get it. They don't see the vision, and as a result, they don't feel particularly confident moving forward with the film. Enter Ralph McQuarrie. Ralph is a talented concept artist that George met a few years prior. So George gets an idea. He convinces Ralph to design a few key screens from the script. And these illustrations result in two critical outcomes. First, they help the executives understand George's vision and ultimately get the film greenlit. And second, they fundamentally shape the eventual look and feel of the entire Star Wars universe. So why tell this story? Well, I believe that great analysts, like great designers, are really compelling storytellers. We help our colleagues align on a vision, we make concepts and progress feel tangible, we rally groups around ideas and results that help them move forward and make decisions. And because of this, the skill of crafting and delivering stories is valuable, not only in helping to develop and sell our findings, it's also really good at building team culture and morale. So today we're going to take a page from the book of filmmaking to help craft some on-brand reports that really captivate our audience. And we're going to use this OKR sample report to tie the entire webinar together. Now, why OKRs, otherwise known as company objectives and key results? Well, selfishly, they're pretty top of mind for us here at Mode as we head into Q2. But broadly, just like those film executives, employees at a company may not always feel particularly convinced or bought in on a set of objectives when they're first proposed. So we're going to take a standard out-of-the-box Mode report that tracks a set of these objectives and key results and turn it from something like this into something more like this. Now, how will we do it? We're going to use some of those lessons from design and filmmaking to better communicate three key things. The who of a report, its character and personality, all the subtle things that make consumers ultimately feel more drawn or connected to a piece of analysis. The why of a report, the plot development, the motivation, the context, why these key results even matter to the business in the first place. And lastly, the what, the TLDR, the cliff notes, making sure that folks can come back to this report time and time again and quickly scan through the analysis to understand what's changed or answer a specific question. Now, throughout this webinar, I'm going to be working off of a custom report theme called Soft Shadows. And if you're interested in trying to follow along as we go, we've made the style sheet available for you to upload into your own workspace as a custom report theme, as well as some other materials that we'll use throughout the presentation. Now, it's worth noting that you do need to be a Mode business customer to create custom chart palettes and custom report themes. But if you're not on a business plan, don't worry, there's still going to be a lot of great takeaways and tips from today's session that you can apply regardless. So you should all have access now to a Google Drive folder, and I believe the link has been posted in chat. Thank you, Jennifer. And in it is a file called Soft Shadows. I believe it's number 2. So if you want to try and follow along, feel free to open the file at this point and go ahead and copy and paste that text to the clipboard. Once you've done that, you're going to head over to Mode and navigate to the Account Settings dropdown located within the Home navigational panel on the left, and you're going to select Workspace Settings. From there, you'll want to select colors. Yeah.
Can I jump in real quick? I just wanted to let everybody know that if you prefer to just watch while Sam's going, this link, we're also going to get it in the follow-up email with the recording. So you can also follow along at your own pace if that works better for you, just so we don't have anyone getting nervous on the call.
Thank you. Yes, appreciate that call out. You can definitely do this on your own asynchronously. So from settings, if you're following along, you can select the colors and themes tab. And from colors and themes, you'll want to navigate to the report themes section and click on the new theme button. From there, you'll give your theme a name. I'm a big fan of alliteration, hence the name Soft Shadows. You'll want to go ahead and paste in all of that CSS and you'll hit save. And then from there, you're in a really good spot to sort of use this from here on out. Anytime you navigate to the report builder, you just have to go into the toolbar and select that custom theme from the theme picker dropdown. If you just added a report theme, you might need to refresh the page for it to show up. But from here on out, you can use it for any report going forward. Or if you really like it, you could even set it as your workspace default so that you don't even have to worry about changing it. It will automatically apply to any new reports. Okay, so now that we've got that theme set up, let's start to dig into the who, otherwise known as character development. All right, oops, going back. Okay, so if you can bear with me on the space ride for a little bit longer, I want to start by admitting a somewhat controversial opinion. I hated the movie Gravity, which miraculously has a 96% score on Rotten Tomatoes, so I'm clearly in the minority here. And it stars Sandra Bullock and George Clooney as astronauts who become stranded in space after their space shuttle self-destructs mid-orbit. And look, don't get me wrong, the visuals are absolutely stunning, but the destruction happens like 5 minutes into the film. I don't know who these people are. Do we like them? Are we rooting for them? Do they have family back home? And yes, some of this comes out throughout the course of the movie, but I could just never get past it. They felt like strangers to me. And regardless of whether or not you agree with this specific take, the more important takeaway here is that people want to build connections to people and to characters. And obviously reports are not people, but visualizations and reporting can sometimes feel a bit vague and generic, but they can also feel really captivating and personalized. And one of the easiest ways to personalize a report is to pull in your company brand colors. But before we start copying and pasting in hex values, I want to talk a little bit about color theory and best practice. Starting with symbolism. In filmmaking, color is used really strategically to set the tone of a scene before any of the actors even utter a word. And each one of us has our own unique mix of emotion, mood, cultural, and societal contexts that all go into influencing how we associate different colors. But some color combinations have almost universal connotations. Take, for example, red and green. These colors are typically understood to have opposing meanings, with one of the most obvious examples of this being the worldwide standard traffic light, right? With red indicating stop and green indicating go. But what does this mean in the context of data visualizations? Well, there are some more obvious things that you might want to do and to avoid if your company's brand color is red or green. For instance, you might not want to use your brand red to indicate that employee attrition has gone down, which typically would be perceived as a good or a positive change. And similarly, you probably don't want to use your brand green to indicate that customer churn has gone up, right? Presumably something that would be perceived as a bad or negative change. And these examples are a bit more obvious, but let's talk a bit about how to actually utilize these kinds of brand colors. So one thing to consider if you have a really punchy brand color like red is to use it for emphasis. If you're building out a dashboard on, say, NPS scores and you want to emphasize detractors, try generating a custom chart palette that uses your brand red and a couple shades of gray to represent the remaining series. Not only will this help build brand recognition, but it also allows you to utilize red's benefit to really create a focal point and an outlier in the analysis. Another tip that works well is to create a palette of varying shades of the same color. So when you're looking at your company's brand guidelines or working with your brand or marketing teams, check to see if you have approved shades of the same color that you could use within Mode. Speaking of design approved colors, rest assured, I'm not here today to make judgments about whether or not I personally think your brand colors look nice. That probably wouldn't be a great use of our time, but I do want to talk a bit about how you might order your brand colors a bit more strategically. And I'll pause here for a question that Jennifer would love to ask y'all.
Yeah, we just want to see some of your reactions in the chat of what you're thinking so far in this webinar. So just curious, how many of you can name, 3 of your company's brand colors just off the top of your head? So feel free to respond to that in the chat as we go along. Oh, nice. Got some more.
Seen a few pop in. Black and white. Yeah, that's a really interesting one. Gray, green, white. Awesome. Yeah, and some folks, this is like a trick question, right? You might not always have 3 primary brand colors. You might typically only have 1. And so, yeah, wouldn't anticipate everyone knowing all the colors, but yeah, this is great.
And I think it might also be interesting if you have any specific challenges, or you feel like you have specific challenges because of the color palette of your organization. Put that in the chat too, because perhaps we can address some of those things in the Q&A down the road.
Awesome. All right, well, I'm going to keep going, but yes, we can definitely talk a bit more about this at the end. So here I have a gradient that maps from light yellow to dark purple, and it feels pretty nice. Now, if I were to create a color progression that mapped the opposite way from light purple to dark yellow, it should feel similar, right? Not really. And when you're looking at the two side by side, one is more likely to sit better with you. And this is actually a result of our subconscious conditioning to gradients that repeatedly appear in nature. A bright yellow or orange transitioning to a really cool purple or blue appears in the most beautiful summer sky. But there isn't really a natural example of the reverse. So consider this when you're sequencing the brand colors in your visualizations, and feel free to experiment with the order when you're creating these palettes in Mode, which we'll get into a little bit later. Finally, I want to touch on color accessibility. Accessibility is extremely important, and we could spend an entire webinar on this alone. When thinking about accessibility, there's a lot to consider. There's first the contrast between your visualization and the background, the container of the report itself. Then there's the contrast between individual colors in a palette. And keep in mind, that's going to look different when you're mapping really solid colors in something like an area or a pie chart versus very thin lines in a multi-series line. And then there's the contrast for those experiencing color blindness. And if all of this feels a bit overwhelming, don't worry. It's really important to remember that one brand palette does not need to rule them all. You can create multiple brand palettes for different scenarios, 2 series versus 20 series, line chart versus area. And we'll go through the process of making a palette together in a minute. But again, feel free to experiment with your brand colors inside of Mode. Now, today I'm going to focus specifically on categorical color palettes that can be applied to our quick charts and within the Visual Explorer. All right, so speaking of practice, let's come back to our report example. This is what we're aiming to end up with by the end of the webinar, right? By the time we get out of here. So I want to start by putting together a customized brand palette for this fictitious brand, Bake Bites. Bake Bites produces and sells bite-sized baking tutorials, and yes, I just made that up. But Bake Bites also has one primary brand color, this beautiful electric purple, and they've got a couple approved secondary colors as well. So similar to the chat, one main one, got a couple secondary. So thinking back to that gradient from before, I'm going to order these colors strategically from blue to yellow. And I'm going to make sure that the primary brand colors are as close to the start of the palette as possible. And why do that? Well, when you're creating charts, if you have one series, it's going to default to that first color in the palette. And so the more you rely on your brand colors, your primary brand colors to be at the start, the more often you're likely to see them within your reports. So this ordering is feeling pretty good, but I want to see how we're doing in terms of broader accessibility. So to test this, I'd recommend uploading a screenshot or an image of your colors or of your palette into a colorblind simulator like this one. You could even do it with a screenshot of a Mode report itself. I'd also suggest checking for the 3 most common types of color blindness: green, red, and blue. So let's do that now by looking at the original set of 5 colors, and then comparing it with what those same colors look like for someone experiencing green blindness. And then again, for those experiencing red blindness, this one is a bit interesting, right? Notice the contrast between 1 and 3 isn't as good as it was in the original set. It's okay, it's noticeable, but as we start to experiment, this is an example of something you might want to tweak, right, when you get into Mode. And here's the third, for those experiencing blue blindness. All in all, things are looking pretty good. We have a pretty solid 5 color palette that we could start adding into our visualizations and using in Mode, feeling good. But what happens when you have a 6 series that you need to visualize? Well, worst case scenario, you end up with a chart that uses the same color to represent multiple series. I feel like we've all been there. You hate to see it. And then alternatively, some BI tools will progressively decrease the saturation and darken the hues automatically, but that starts to feel pretty muddy pretty quickly. Or you could always generate a really large palette from a set of random colors. Maybe you have some brand colors that don't get used very often, or swatches you can pull from your product. But even if you manage to find enough distinct shades, there may not be enough contrast, and it's unlikely to appear cohesive. So instead, try this hack. Once you've created a really solid 5-color palette, make a copy of each color so that you now have 10. Then go in and adjust the light and hue of your duplicates in between the original 5 to effectively stretch the palette out, making sure that you're checking the colorblind simulators as you go. And you end up with something like this, right? 2 matching categorical palettes that feel extremely branded. In this case, I'm going to call them Baked Bites 5 and Baked Bites 10. We've done some initial checks to make sure that they're going to be accessible for our colleagues. So the last step that you can do, or you can have your designer do if you're coming up with these colors together, is to generate a comma separated list of these hex values. That's going to make it incredibly easy to copy paste this list of colors into Mode as a palette. And again, this color palette is available in the webinar kit. So if you want to follow along, you can do so, but you can also play around and experiment with this palette later. So let's get these beautiful colors into Mode. So just like earlier, we're going to start by navigating to the account settings dropdown located within the home navigational panel and select workspace settings. We're going to go right back to that same section, colors and themes, but this time we're going to click that big green button to create a new color palette. Now here's where things get pretty fun. If I have that comma separated list of hex values, I can go ahead and paste it into that section and I'll see a chart generate that gives me a preview of exactly what those colors are going to look like in a stacked bar, for instance. And so you'll want to go ahead and give your palette a name once you're feeling good about it, but this could also be the phase at which you start to experiment with the ordering. So you can always paste these hex values in one by one, but a quick tip is to just paste that full list in if you're feeling good about it, and then you just have to hit save. So let's talk about how you would apply this custom brand palette to your charts in Mode. And there are 2 primary ways. And again, we're focused on categorical palettes today. So from a report, you can assign an entire palette to a quick chart by using the color dropdown here. So you can see I've got Berry Blast selected and I can assign that full palette. But if I'm in the Visual Explorer, I can do a bit more customization. Maybe I want to assign that reddish blue or that pinkish red rather to call out the segment of users who haven't yet hit their seat adoption, right? I want to give it a bit more visual focus from that purple. I can assign very specific values from this palette to my individual series using the color modal in the Visual Explorer. So a couple different options depending on how much customization you want to do and what mode of charting you happen to be in. All right, so after updating the colors of all of our charts, the report now looks something like this. And already this is pretty different than the default template we've started with, right? We've got a different background, different fonts, and our branded colors. And so this is already one step closer to a pretty compelling dashboard. But if you don't have brand colors available and you would like to start experimenting with these tips, I cannot recommend Coolors enough. You can use this generator to create beautiful 5-shade palettes. And to make it even better, if you do have 1 or 2 brand colors, but you need to come up with a few more to accommodate 5-6 series, you can actually paste your hex value in and lock it while continuing to shuffle through other colors. So in this example, you can see I've got my Baked Bites purple on the left, but I can alternate through those other 4 shades on the right until I find something that I'm happy with. And so this is really great if you have maybe only 1 or 2 brand colors and you want to come up with some complementary colors that are going to look cohesive together. All right, so now that we have one sharp and customized looking report character, I want to move on to the plot and talk about the value of context setting, or perhaps the repercussions of not having enough context. So we've probably all been there. One minute you're relaxed on the couch watching a movie when a partner or loved one sits down beside you. And normally you'd be happy to see them, but you're already 45 minutes into the film, they've never seen it, and now you find yourself bombarded with questions about the backstory and the plot so that they can try to play catch up. And similarly, the analyst version of the scenario might look something like this. You're in the zone, heads down on something when a stakeholder pings you with a quick question, except it's never quick and it's rarely just one. We ask a lot of questions about context, and I want to pause here for a moment to hear what kinds of context questions come up the most for y'all.
Yes, awesome. So we have another poll about this, and this poll, we made it a little bit tongue in cheek, since I'm sure these are all things that analysts can kind of rally around and share their stories about. But we'd love to know kind of what questions are the most common that you receive after delivering your reports to stakeholders. You know, are they like, hey, where does this number even come from? Do they ask you to pull new analysis really quickly? What the difference is between one report and the next report. So there's a few different options on there, and we'll give you a minute to fill that out. And while we're paused here, this could also be a great time if any questions are coming up to type those into the Q&A field. Because I know sometimes during the presentation, you don't want to miss a minute to type your question in, but feel free to do that. And Nancy, whenever you think we have enough responses, you can feel free to share those results. Okay, so we definitely have a mixed bag, which I always enjoy, but it looks like the top 3 are the most common with this group. So we have about 22% saying, where does this number come from? 26% saying, can you pull X real quick too? And 24% asking if another report can be created showing, different data. So that's good. And then we also have people that are asking about the differences and then comparing so that they don't get the context of what the data is showing compared to the previous history. So, and then, yes, okay. We got a chat asking about if this will be shared. And yes, we will be sharing a recording of this following the webinar. So thanks for participating in our poll, and Sam, you can take it away again.
All right. No, that is fantastic. We're going to focus a lot on context questions today, right? When you just don't have enough context to sort of make sense of the data that you're looking at. And why is that, right? Well, at any given moment, we're all holding varying degrees of context in our heads, which can lead to varying degrees of interpretation and degrees of ability to even make conclusions about the data at all. So how might we capture more of our context within the report itself to potentially avoid some of these follow-up questions? Well, for starters, we could write down the questions or things we anticipate coming up the most. Are these OKRs that I'm looking at specific to a department or company-wide? Which objective is this key result serving again? And sorry, what was the objective? So maybe we spell out that the KR this chart is tracking is KR 1.1. We define what the definition of done is, that it means 90% of new customers have hit our seed adoption target. Maybe we even detail what that adoption target is. And we remind folks of the KR this objective is in service of. Objective 1, that involves improving our new user adoption holistically. Now, you may not always have all of this context either, right? You might have to work with stakeholders or even ask that someone share this type of documentation so that you can repurpose it here. But these are all examples of bits of context that we could detail directly in our reports. And the fact that I have 3 primary pieces of metadata here is also not coincidental. This is actually yet another film trick. The rule of thirds is a composition recommendation, and it's used in everything from photography to interior design. In movies, it helps to create visual interest by placing your subject within 1/3 of the frame and leaving 2/3 of the frame more open. In interior design and graphic design, it's used to determine the amount of distinct items we display at any given time, the padding or the spacing between those items, and the size and hierarchy. Take this beautiful West Elm dresser, for example. Notice that there are 3 distinct items on the top. There's a set of books, a bowl, and a plant. And while the bowl and plant are closer together, the books are a bit further away. All of these decisions are strategic. All of these subconsciously make the decor more pleasing to the eye. And so let's apply some of these hierarchy and padding strategies using Mode text boxes so that we can apply all of this amazing context to our company objectives inside of the report. So to make space for my copy, I'm first going to start by adjusting the width and height of my charts. So you can see now that I've stacked every chart into one single column, and then I've created effectively a placeholder column on the left for all my text. Next, I can start to add text boxes and position them besides the charts. And I can do this by using the text button in the toolbar of the report builder. By default, when I paste my copy into a text box or when I type it, I'm going to notice that everything's equally sized and equally spaced by default. So thinking back to those decorations on the dresser, let's quickly style these so that the spacing feels more thoughtful and the different sections of type are more easy to discern. So first, I'm going to update the KR to an H2 so it feels a little bit more prominent. And then I'm going to keep the result details in the body format because this is what I would anticipate getting read the most. It also might warrant the most space if I need to really clarify what exactly completing KR 1.1 means. But I will adjust the spacing so that the content is a little bit more centered and so that we can keep the KR and the KR description closer together. And you'll notice I've started to give the objective a bit more breathing room since that's a separate piece of information. And last but not least, I'm going to update the objective text to an H5. And this is because I don't anticipate this getting read every single time. It's easier to scan over if I don't need this information, but it also immediately differentiates it from the body copy. So all of these subtle techniques are going to make it, one, look more appealing, but two, actually make it a lot easier to digest and scan as a stakeholder when you're coming in to check in on these results. So if we do that work for each key result, your report should now look something like this. And honestly, these 3 changes alone, applying that soft shadow report theme, using our custom brand palettes, and adding content with text boxes is pretty great. You could easily stop here. But I promised you on brand reports that go above and beyond. And I'd say right now we're above. We've got a really good looking dashboard, but I want to go over some final tips for those instances where maybe you've got a bit more time, maybe you're feeling a little spicy, maybe you're able to ask a designer for a few favors. Which leads me to our last topic, the what. And when it comes to analysis, the what is primarily the data, the output, the results. But we can do subtle things without overshadowing the data so that stakeholders want to come back every single day because they're excited to look at the report and because they know they can quickly find whatever it is that they need. And speaking of needs, I want to go back 2 years to 2020, which was a very hard and unusual year. But one of the ways we coped was by watching a boatload of The Office. In fact, the whopping 57 billion minutes users spent watching The Office was 45% more than the second highest ranked show, Grey's Anatomy, which is what I personally decided to watch all 300 glorious episodes. But for a bit of a timeline refresh, The Office first premiered in 2005, back when MySpace was the website of choice and Twitter was a year away from launching. In 2013, The Office became available for streaming on Netflix for the first time. So it's safe to say that by 2020, most people weren't hearing about this show for the first time. So why rewatch a show during a pandemic, or why rewatch a show at all? Well, it turns out psychologists have studied this quite a bit, and there are 2 primary reasons. We do it to restore a sense of self-control, and we do it to provide comfort when we feel depleted. We tend to look to familiar shows when we're down or tired. They simply put, require less brain energy from us. And designers talk about this all the time in the context of cognitive load, which relates to the amount of information that the working memory can hold at any given time. So the more we're asked to hold, the more overwhelming things become, and the longer it takes to make sense of something. So one way to reduce cognitive load is to support visual indicators that aid in scannability. These things can give consumers or stakeholders clues around things like progress or status. For instance, I can tell at a glance that I'm a bit less than halfway through the finale of Selling Sunset Season 5 by looking at this red progress bar. And you can tell at a glance because I just added this white arrow to point directly to it, right? Drawing your eye to that bar specifically. So maybe stakeholders aren't going to be as excited to check in on their OKR progress every morning as we are to watch our favorite guilty pleasure shows. But I like to think that we could convey progress in a way that feels more exciting and more encouraging. So when you think about OKR status, you could indicate that things are on track, they're complete, they're behind schedule, or my personal favorite, above and beyond. Maybe the team absolutely crushed a goal, 2x'd it halfway through the quarter. We can celebrate that in our reporting using imagery and visuals. So let's talk about some of the ways that we could visually represent progress or status. We could use relative status bars. The pro here is that you could be a bit more granular in terms of representing how far away you are from a scale of 0 to 100. The con here is that they're a bit more granular and you'll have to update these manually on some kind of cadence, right? And that's a consideration with all of these. And so I'd recommend deciding who would maintain these assets and how often. It's not going to be worth necessarily adding this type of imagery to every report, but there might be instances where you really want to inspire folks to check in on a dashboard every day by adding some of these more compelling visuals. Our team personally landed on updating our branded badging once a week, and that works pretty well for us. Speaking of badging, we could call out each discrete phase using color-coded text, Or you could maybe designate emojis for each status, or similarly icons or illustrations. And this is where I'd encourage y'all to be really creative and experimentational. You don't necessarily have to convey status. You could convey other iconography, right? That helps to give detailed information about what it is that they're looking at. And there are a lot of free design tools like Canva that can help you build these assets, as well as open source tools like the Noun Project that are fantastic if you just want to look up a concept like Complete and download existing PNGs or JPEGs. For today's example, I'm going to go with these lovely text badges. And so we're going to go ahead and add these to the text boxes. Now, if you're using or you have access to a design tool like Figma, adding these badges into a mode report is pretty dead simple. You can simply copy your asset to the clipboard as a PNG and instantly paste it into that text box. So here I am just pasting that badge in, boom, I've got that orange badge. Alternatively, if you do not have access to a design tool, do not fear. You can upload any image you find or download by clicking on the image icon in the text box element and selecting the file that you want to import. And this will insert the image anywhere that you have your cursor placed. So you can, again, play around the flexibility of where you want to position these images relative to the other text. So after adding the badges, we now have something that looks a little bit like this. So for my last two enhancements, I'm actually going to hop into the HTML. And I want to give a disclaimer. I am not an engineer. I am not particularly confident when it comes to experimenting with HTML, but these tips are intended to help you get your feet wet if you're curious about using the HTML editor but haven't had much opportunity. So to make this report feel more official and important, I really want to add the Bake Bytes logo to the top of the report. Now, I could add it to the body by using a PNG or JPEG, just like we did with the badges in the previous example. I could upload it straight into a text box, but that's going to force me to add it below the title of my report, and I really want it anchored at the top. I'm also not sure exactly how large I need the logo to be yet. Well, this is where SVGs really come in handy. They're a web-friendly vector file format as opposed to pixel-based JPEGs or PNGs that use mathematical formulas and points and lines on a grid so that they can be resized and recolored and redrawn indefinitely. And SVGs also output some handy code that we can use within the HTML. So pretend for the purposes of this GIF that my SVG width and height in the text are responding as I'm scaling this animation, right? But the idea is that there's code being generated that actually populates this image. So I want to use some of this SVG code inside of Mode using the HTML editor. Here's how we do that. First, navigate back to the report builder where we're spending a lot of our time and open the HTML editor by clicking on that HTML toggle. This is going to open the panel right above your report builder itself. Then I'm just going to go ahead and paste in my SVG code directly above my title, my H1, and click apply. And you can see that it's been inserted directly above my report title, which is exactly where I wanted it. But again, if you don't know how to get this code, how to get access to it, any designer on your team should be able to help you find it. And a lot of brand kits will usually include SVGs as a supported file format. Printers love SVGs. There's a lot of great uses for them. And so it's typically pretty easy to get to. But I want to do a progress check. Here's how our report is looking. We've got our badges, we've got our company logo. And again, I just want to say if you don't have access to an SVG or you don't feel comfortable using the HTML editor, you can always upload your logo as a PNG or a JPEG. But this should start to give you a bit of a sense of how you could inject elements in your layout in a more customizable way. So here I was really able to take control about not only the size and color of my logo, but also the placement, right? I can have it anchored at the top, so it's the first thing that users will see when they land on that dashboard. So I will wrap up with one last HTML trick, a tribute to those beautiful gradients from earlier, section dividers. And this is also a really great way to add brand personality to your reports without having to impact the visualizations themselves. Now, similar to the logo, you could choose to upload a static image of a line or a rectangle and add it as a text box. But when you add dividers using HTML, you can customize the thickness and the color, and you don't have to worry about whether the width is going to adjust to match the width of your report. So HTML line dividers are going to be really flexible. So I'm going to open up the HTML editor again using the same toggle as before. And then I'm going to zoom in a bit so we can see the code that's being written. I'm now going to add a style tag at the very top of our code. And we have some instructions on how to do this yourself if you want to try experimenting with this gradient line. But this is where we're going to contain all of our instructions on the styling of this lovely bar. And speaking of which, I'll go ahead and do some of that now. So I'm going to add an HR, which is short for horizontal rule and is the perfect element for, well, a horizontal rule. It's exactly what we're adding. And I'm going to add two properties, the background and the height. And that's really all I need here. To get this gradient effect, though, we're going to use a linear gradient. And you don't have to be this fancy. You could easily do a solid color. But in the same way that we pasted in that comma separated list of values for our chart palette earlier, you could paste it right in here to create that gradient effect. And I'm just going to set my height to 4 pixels to see how it feels, and then I can always adjust it later. The last step to take to get your lines to show up throughout your report is to add a class anywhere you want to place the divider. So in this case, I'm inserting it directly above my first row of charts. You can see that called out in the row at the very bottom. And I'm just going to insert this HR class to insert the divider line. And it can be a bit disorienting when we're looking at this code out of context. So I'm going to zoom out for a bit so you can see where I actually inserted that HR class. So I've got my style code all the way at the top. You can see my SVG is right up next above the report title. And then I've got my new beautiful horizontal rule below my report title, but above that first row of charts. And we went through this pretty fast. So like I said, if you want to recreate this in your own time, please feel free to check out the webinar assets. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of the movie, to a report that looks pretty easy to scan, feels extremely personalized, and is frankly pretty pleasing on the eyes. But more importantly, these objectives start to feel more like a journey that you're on together as a company, a movie with a really solid plot, an episode that excites you every time you come back to watch it. And remember, you do not have to get here all at once. You can pull bits and pieces from these suggestions. You can choose to try it out for, really special reports or initiatives, whatever works best for you. So with that, what questions can we answer for y'all?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sam. And yeah, to Sam's last point there, of kind of starting small by starting to apply some of these topics. We'd love to know in the chat just which of the design tips shared today you are most excited about adding to your reports. We all got a response for the gradient bar. And Sam, we do have some questions for you. So the first question is about the big value chart. And they're curious if the second line in the big value, if there is a way to change it from being all caps all the time.
Yeah, so there's a couple ways to think about chart formatting, right? There's some formatting that we support out of the box. So when you're actually editing a big value itself. And then there are also things you can customize from within a report theme. So at the very beginning of the presentation, I shared the style sheet for soft shadows. And if you start to play around a little bit in that code, you'll notice that there are distinct CSS callouts for big values where you can customize the font, color, weight, size of both the big value itself, the description copy, and even the trend. And so if you're really interested in customizing, specific aspects of text or labels, I'd encourage you to play around with the soft shadows theme and start adjusting some of that yourself to kind of see how it feels. But that is definitely something that you can target in a report theme and apply specific styling to.
Awesome. And then, sorry, I was trying to answer another question in the back end. Another question is how can I assign specific color to values in a visualization so that it follows the gradient like you suggest? It seems that Mode assigns colors by default.
Yeah. And that was true for quite some time, right? So we talked about this a little bit in the demo of adding a custom chart palette, but there are two ways to think about assigning colors today. If you're using quick charts, you can apply custom palettes, but you apply them all at once, right? So you have the option to assign a palette, which will map the values left to right, which to the point of whoever asked the question, doesn't give you as much customization around the actual ordering. So one thing you can do is be really strategic with the ordering up front, the default ordering. So when we talked about actually generating that chart palette, we show you a chart preview so you can kind of experiment with the ordering there. But if you're in the Visual Explorer, you also have full control over selecting which colors you want to assign to which series. So there might be situations where you do need to work outside of the default order, or you want to kind of pick and choose from even multiple palettes. You can do all of that from within the Visual Explorer color modal now. So if you're feeling like, you want to get more customization out of colors, I would definitely recommend converting even existing quick charts to the Visual Explorer mode and then manipulating the colors from there.
Awesome. And then we have another question. Are the use of our notebooks and their outputs from something like ggplot able to adopt color themes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I unfortunately don't know of like a really easy way to map or apply out of the box palettes, or even, branded palettes to R or Python notebooks. A lot of that would have to be manual today. I mean, if you had those sort of hex values written down, you could definitely manually use them, right, as values within the notebooks. We don't have a great way to do that automatically or at scale. But it's definitely something that we've talked a lot about, is how to get the benefits of your brand colors within the notebooks as well.
Awesome. And then what is the recommended workflow for getting all of the context into reports? I don't always have all of that info from my stakeholders, or even if I do, I'm not always sure how to frame it. So do you have any tips for workflow?
Yeah. So the suggestion that comes to mind is actually really similar to how I approach slide decks as well, which is to start with an outline, like even detailing out, here are the things I anticipate folks being unclear about, right? Just based on looking at the metrics alone, here's some pieces of context that I think might be helpful, and just starting to kind of jot those down. And then from there, it might look like collaborating with folks across the company to pull relevant documentation, right? So for OKRs at Mode, we have company-wide documents that we share that detail out a lot of the specifics that we could kind of then pull into these reports. But there might be situations where, the documentation doesn't exist and you need to define it together. So yeah, I think my 2 tips would be to start with an outline, just kind of jotting down the bits of context you think would be helpful to include, and then working with folks that have context or have that documentation available.
Awesome. And then we have one final question so far, is about if this report that you used throughout the demonstration will be available like in the community workspace so that other people can look at it for reference. Is that possible?
Yeah, that's a really good idea. Yeah, we can definitely talk about doing that. It's using sample data now, so that feels like something we could make accessible. And then, we've also, for the folks attending the webinar, provided the hex values for creating this chart palette, the divider tip, and then also that background style sheet. And I really like the style sheet because it's very simple and just pretty minimal, right? With these whites, blacks, and grays. And so you can really infuse a lot of your own brand personality and kind of differentiate it by adding things like these custom brand colors.
Yeah, and if you haven't had a chance to look at that design kit yet, Sam also put together like a step-by-step little guide of showing you how to use the resources in there. So even if we don't have this as a sample report in the community, right away, you have everything at your disposal there to recreate this that's been provided. So that's pretty cool, at least as a stopgap if we're able to do that. Yes, and these will all be provided in the follow-up email as a reminder there too. All right, I think that we have all of our questions answered. So we have one final question for you, our attendees. And so Nancy, if you want to launch that final poll, we're curious to know if there's any of the topics that we talked through today that you'd be interested in learning more about in a maybe future webinar, maybe future course or other format. And then as it's closing, I just want to remind you as well that when you close Zoom and you close out of the webinar, when we're all done, you'll get a pop-up in your browser that's going to ask you to rate the webinar and provide some feedback that way. So we'd really appreciate it if you'd be willing to spend that extra few seconds to provide feedback on your experience today. All right, I think we can close this poll and wrap everything up. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll see you at the next Mode webinar.
Thanks, y'all.